So really today I want to talk to you about these Russian-speaking APT groups that are transitively linked and related. And I'll go over sort of a simple model where we can clarify sort of clusters of activity and resources. And I'd like to maybe drop a few nuggets of information to add to the public discussion about some of these groups that may not, well, that may help provide some insight into how these groups are linked and what they're all about. When I heard about something, a conference related to disruption, destruction, those sorts of things, right away I thought of black energy. The 2014 event was really interesting to myself and a colleague named Maria. Hades has been it's been spoken about here and there in blogs, but this is another APT that's very interesting and shows up in the October indictment, I believe. We'll talk about Sophacy, and then Zebracy is another interesting subgroup. It has been discussed as just malware, but it's kind of taken on a label of its own or a grouping of its own. When I'm looking at data on these groups, this is how I kind of cluster their activity together. So with Hades, they were the guys responsible for Olympic Destroyer and the Wipers, false flag effort behind trying to appear as though they were an Asian organization. Sophacy is supported by Hades. So Hades is sort of this front-leaning organization that supports other efforts, special efforts. And Sophacy happens to be one of them. You'll see in the October indictment lots of mention of X-Agent and these guys who are performing close access operations. Zebracy is very interesting because of its link to black energy and their movement away from X-Agent and sort of the older, elegant code base they'd been using and towards just churning out newer tools in Go, in C#, and all sorts of stuff. Scripting languages, Delphi, and then their use of remote templates with Empire-enabled PowerShell macros is kind of hot right now. As a matter of fact, it's very hot. I'll talk about that in a second. And then Black Energy, of course, is well known, and they are very closely tied with Gray Energy. In my opinion, it is the same group. And I will talk a little bit more about a piece of data that leads me to that. So this simplifies it all. I'm kind of done. Hades has a lot of overlap with Sophacy. You'll see in the October indictment that these guys who were performing Wi-Fi man-in-the-middle were delivering X-Tunnel, X-Agent, Responder, all these other tools, and supporting the push to Canadian officials, ethics officials' laptops. But X-Agent shows up all the time in relation to these Wi-Fi operations. Sophacy is this older core group that deploys X-Agent. It was partly behind the DNC, or at least monitoring X-Agent within the DNC environment. Zebracy is loosely tied to them. They shared infrastructure and some WHOIS data when that existed. And then they have a lot of overlap with Black Energy, and we'll look at that in a second. So Hades themselves, really, they are technically advanced. They provide penetration services to other groups like Sophacy, as you'll read in the October indictment. One of the interesting things I'd say there are two interesting points on this slide. One, they're still active. So we've seen spear phishing from them in October. Most likely they're targeting Ukraine and possibly some European organizations. And then finally, there isn't any evidence that they've been supporting Zebracy or Black Energy, but they are still active. The indictment did not shut down their operations. Sophacy is interesting because they're going away. I don't see SPLM or X-Agent much anymore. It's either they are going to sleep for a while, like APT29 did, and coming back. But SPLM and X-Agent only showed up once in a Eastern European network in November. That's rare for us to see. And they seem to be going away, while Zebracy, on my next slide, is coming into focus. So Zebracy was in the news recently, but really they've been targeting organizations, diplomatic organizations, with this Canon backdoor since March. And they are highly active right now. They have shifted not only from targeting exclusively Central Asian diplomatic organizations to worldwide attacks now. So Western networks might see more of not the Canon backdoor, but they've shifted back to their Delphi backdoors and now are targeting the rest of the world. So it seems to me that these guys, they really are replacing a lot of the SOPHICY activity we've seen in the past. They are not terribly technically advanced. You won't see 0-day from these guys. And they share infrastructure, build IDs, and they spearfish from the same IPs. The same IPs are shared between Black Energy and Zebracy. That's really interesting stuff. Black Energy themselves is very interesting. They used a Siemens exploit, a remote server-side exploit to run arbitrary code on industrial control systems back in 2014. And then 2 years later, in January of 2016, we saw Gray Energy doing the same thing in a smaller nation, using a Siemens exploit to download and run arbitrary code from an IP address that was previously used for 2 years by Black Energy. So I think it's pretty solid that these two groups are actually just the same, simply retooled or started using malware. Finally, I'd just like to point out that there is a long history of overlaps between these groups, and sometimes unexpected overlap. Mike Scott presented on how overlap between Zebracy and Turla happened in June, I believe it was, with their LNK files. It's really unusual to see between these sharing between these groups, although it goes back to 2013 when we saw Miniduke sharing some of the same self-protection lists in their Miniduke backdoors as we started seeing in WinIDS downloaders at the time. So there's a long history of sharing, and sometimes it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. I expect to continue to see this sort of aggressive activity from Black Energy and Hades. I expect to see a lot less usage of X-Agent. Either they're retooling or they're changing something up, but when I only see one instance in November, it really means things are drying up. Increased use of open source and modification of open source malware, and the targeting, we're going to continue to see Ukraine. I mean, there was just another conflict between some ships, and the tensions are raising. So we're going to continue to see that sort of activity. The Central Asian ex-Soviet states are always under attack from these guys, and I do not see anything other than X-Agent diminishing at this point. So with that, are there any questions?
You'll have to ask Kurt at Beers.
We'll keep on going. Thank you, Kurt.